Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here, continuing to ring in the new year of 2020 with visionaries and prognosticators, people who are trying to get out ahead of where things are going. And one of our favorite guests who's been doing that for a full 10 years now is Rohit Bhargava. Rohit is the founder of the Non-Obvious company. He's a Wall Street Journal best-selling author. He's been writing the Non-Obvious Guide for 10 full years. He has many, many books to his credit. He's a keynote speaker, really wonderful guest on the show. And I would like to welcome Rohit Bhargava to Trending in Education. Welcome back, Rohit.
Thank you. I always love having a chat with you.
Awesome. And you've been doing the trend spotting thing formally through some kind of yearly release since 2011. So this is the 10th year in which you've looked out at what's going on in the world around you. You spent a lot of time with Post-its and collages. Your method is very interesting, and we've talked about it many times over the years. We could probably dig in a little bit more to it now. But 2020 must have been a fascinating year for you, considering it's your 10th year of looking for non-obvious trends, and it is the round number of 2020, setting us up for the next decade, which feels very space age and futuristic. What was it like setting up for your trend spotting book this 10th time heading into 2020?
You know, the biggest difference, I think, was that it really felt like I was taking the greatest hits of the greatest hits, if you know what I mean. So every year, like you said, I do something pretty crazy if you think about it, which is I release a new version of the same book with 15 brand new trends. And so,
Right.
you know, logistically what that means is that I'm republishing this book with the entire middle section, probably about 80 pages, totally rewritten. So I essentially take out 80 pages from the last year's edition and replace them with 10 new trends. And so
Right.
every year I have 15 new trends, which if you do the math means well over 100 trends over the years.
Yep.
And this year, what I decided to do, because of the round number and being a decade and really it giving me a chance to look backwards, is I started by saying, okay, well, let's look at those 100 trends and let's see what the commonalities were between those 100 trends.
Mm-hmm.
And the benefit of doing that, and the reason why I think it worked in this case, is because every year what I've also done with my team is I've gone back, looked at the trends that were predicted and graded them based on whether they continued to have an impact on our culture and how we
Right.
think or not, right? So
Right.
there's been a lot of transparency. And so I know which trends, you know, they didn't all equally impact our world over time, right? So a lot of people say, well, look, anytime you're doing trends, like, that's speculation, right? You don't know you just kind of put it out there. And a lot of
Right.
times what we see is people put these trends out there and then there's not a lot of accountability to say, look, did I get this right?
Right. I've stolen your quote frequently of you ask a futurist whether their prediction has come true yet. Their answer is either yes or not yet. So thank you for that one. I've borrowed it liberally because it's pretty spot on.
Yeah, it is. You know, and I read a lot of work from futurists, and look, they're not bad people, but I don't typically describe myself as a futurist because I haven't usually looked at things on that sort of time scale, but also I really focus not so much on what could happen, but on what is happening that will happen more.
Right.
And it seems like it's maybe a small distinction, but when I describe what a trend is, my definition of it is that it's a curated observation of the accelerating present.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing, right? Because what I'm saying is, look, something's happening right now. And because that thing is happening and it's changing how we see the world or how we choose to buy something or how we choose to sell something or how we learn, right? Which is totally relevant for what we're going to talk about. Right. What does that mean for the future? And how do I use that either myself as an individual or in my organization as an organization?
Yeah, and I really like the idea of the accelerating present. It reminds me of William Gibson's quote, you know, the future is here now, it's just not evenly distributed. You know, if you can sense where the future's already here, you know, in some ways you're not identifying things that will happen in the future. you're identifying things that are already happening today. It's just many of us aren't noticing those things, which I guess is where the non-obvious side comes in. So you've certainly whetted our appetite. So thank you for that. Because each year it's always fun to track the 15 trends, and there's nice charts and iconography in the non-obvious guides. They're also very practical guides. They tell you what this trend means to you, both as an individual, as an entrepreneur, as somebody in a bigger organization. Um, I was scanning through some of your mega trends, Rohit, and they all sound really interesting. I mean, you do a nice job of crafting the language here. Um, are there any that you feel are particularly relevant to learning or the broader field of education in the next 10 years?
For sure. I mean, I think that to some degree, maybe all of them have some application in terms of
Yep.
learning and education. I mean, there's one in particular that is specifically about how we expect to learn anything faster. I mean, I called it
Mm-hmm.
instant knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And that particular megatrend was based on a past trend from a past year that I termed light speed learning, which I know we've
Yep.
talked about on the
Yep.
show.
Mm-hmm.
And instant knowledge is really the extension of that, that says in a world where we can get access to the information we need when we need it, what happens to the value of mastery and wisdom?
Mm-hmm.
And there's an upside and a downside, right? I mean, the upside is, look, I can access everything. I can watch that YouTube video super quickly and teach myself how to do the bare minimum I need to do, and I can sort of hack that, right? I can do
Right.
the growth hacking thing that, and hack my own education and
Yeah.
do that specific thing and maybe learn a language faster, or maybe do these things. But at the same time, I'm not spending that concentrated amount of time that really in the philosophy of learning is what it takes to
Yeah.
acquire that wisdom. And so
Right.
it really is this, like with many of these trends, it's not necessarily only positive or only negative. I mean, there's some positives and there's some negatives.
Right. Right. Well, it's also that one ties also, like we did a show recently on OK Boomer, the trend around the sort of generational strife, whether it's real or sort of perceived. But that is an interesting one too, where increasingly the younger generations are again, this is a broad stereotype, so take it with a grain of salt. But the younger generations are thinking that they have as direct access to the truth as their elders. So I think it does sort of compound some of the challenges of don't trust anyone over 30, because now a sharp 22-year-old really has access to all the information that has ever been uh, logged in the world, and she really just needs to have some focused intent to really get definitive information. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
and what's interesting about that one, like all of the mega trends, is at the back of the chapter about it, I take a look back at what the past trends were that informed it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you look at that one in particular, there were 4 trends from previous reports that kind of factored into
Mm.
the curation of instant of this trend now of instant knowledge, which was
Yes.
back in 2013. There were 2 trends that I wrote about. One that I called degree-free learning, which is
Mm.
essentially what it sounds like, right? People
Yeah.
choosing to learn without necessarily needing to have a degree attached to it.
Yep.
And something that I called method consulting, which was this idea that entrepreneurs and companies that were doing really well were now opening an arm of the company to teach others how to do what they do, sort of the Disney
Mm.
Institute type of
Mm-hmm.
mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And those were both in 2013. In 2014, I wrote about what I call distributed expertise, which was the idea that we now have access to expertise that was previously unavailable to us.
Right.
So now the modern example of that would be, like, I can go online and I could learn how to play the banjo from Steve Martin, right?
Right.
Um, I
Right.
didn't have access to that before, and now I do.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm.
And then light speed learning, which we talked about, which is we just learn everything faster.
Right.
And
Yeah.
now instant knowledge, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
could kind of see this progression to say that over these past several years, like when we elevate our thinking, this is the bigger, broader idea.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it reminds me of when we were prepping. It reminds me of the idea of uh, writing for a smart audience. And speaking to someone who is not a dummy, someone who is playing with her head up and is trying to get a read on where the world is heading. When that is your intended audience, there's a different level of tone and perspective and in some ways strong opinions um, that I think there is a hunger for. I'd love to get your perspective on that because I do think Non-Obvious certainly comes across to me as a smart brand, and when you're putting these guides together. Um, you seem to think somewhat highly of your audience. I think you seem to almost embrace growth mindset in terms of the audience that you're writing to.
I totally do. And you know, one of the things that you mentioned is this idea that, yeah, you know, people aren't dummies anymore. And in fact, one of the things that we've done with this non-obvious brand beyond this one book is we've launched an entire guidebook series designed for people who expect to be able to learn anything faster. You know, and I want to share something with you, which I think you and your audience will definitely find interesting, which is when we were crafting the vision for this non-obvious guide series, we actually wrote a persona for
Mm.
the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And the audience persona that we wrote, we called the person who would read these guides the time-starved doer. And I thought it'd be interesting to just quickly read you like maybe 2 or 3 lines of
Sure.
that description, right? So
Yeah.
we named, like with most, I mean, look, I grew up in the marketing world. And so
Yeah.
when marketing people write personas, like we name the person we're writing
Yeah.
about, a fictional name, right? Like that's the
Sure.
persona.
Right.
So in this case, the persona was named Arya.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes, Arya is about to start something new. She's curious, ambitious, and willing to learn, but doesn't have a lot of time for it. Her title doesn't define her, nor does her age. If there's anything that defines her, it's the belief that she's smart enough to learn just about anything quickly.
Mm.
She's no dummy. Yet she doesn't describe herself as an expert at everything and knows sometimes she needs help.
Mm.
Like that's the mindset, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what we were trying to write for. And I don't think that a lot of quote unquote guidebooks that are written for business audiences are written with that mindset in mind.
Right. Yeah. It's. I've heard you describe it also as like having coffee with an expert. So like
Correct.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
That's the
that's sort of
tagline. Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. That kind of tone, I think, makes it really readable and digestible, but not sort of not talking down to you, not expecting you to be less sharp than you are. So we talk about multi-potentialites and polymaths. So the sharp generalist is an interesting um, idea, and the time-starved. What was it?
Time-starved doer.
Time-starved doer. That's a good one as well. So the sharp generalist, who's also a time-starved doer, will need to get that instant knowledge, and you're designing for that persona. Super, super interesting stuff. So we talked about instant knowledge, which I think is super relevant on multiple fronts. We also have talked on the show about brain computer interfaces because we're all waiting for the Neuralink to be fully operational so that we could just download Kung Fu. It's been 20 years since the Matrix, and we still can't download Kung Fu. So I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. Where is that? I feel like I need it now.
Please, right? I mean, you and me both. But yeah, with the instant knowledge, I think certainly is going to be a relevant one. Are there other ones out there? There's one that I saw you talked about that I think captured my imagination a bit too, is the notion of attention wealth. I thought that was an interesting turn of phrase, and I actually needed to dig into the non-obviousness of that to understand exactly what you were getting at. But it felt like a big idea, and I think it does. I think it could be positioned as empowering to learners if they begin to truly understand and unlock the attention wealth that they have. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one in particular, and then sure any others. It's always it's like the holiday season just keeps giving when we have Rohit in early January. But I'd love to get your thoughts on attention wealth and then any others that just might capture your imagination.
Yeah. Attention wealth was really based on something that I think we all know, which is that we're in a information economy, and so our attention is the currency, right? That's not new. A lot of people
Hmm.
have written about and talked about that. But
Yeah.
what I tried to focus on when it came to attention wealth is, if we are in this information economy, then our attention should generate wealth for us,
Hmm.
as opposed to wealth for other people.
Hmm.
And I think that we are in this flux moment right now where, yes, there's more and more situations where our data is being used by someone else in order to generate revenue for themselves, right? I.e.,
Right.
Facebook.
Right.
And so everything that they know about us allows them to serve ads, and then they make money on it. We don't actually get anything from that.
Right.
But there's more and more situations, like if you think about this new law around privacy in California,
Mm.
that are putting this data that everyone has been collecting about us back into our control.
Hmm.
And there's more expectation that we are able to now take it back. Even
Right.
on Facebook, there's a way, a lot of people don't know this, but there's a way to download everything that you've ever posted onto Facebook so you get it
Yeah.
back, right?
Right. Right.
And these things didn't necessarily exist several years ago.
Right.
Even though Facebook's had that for a long time, it's just buried.
Right.
But because that is happening now, like, we have the ability to say, look, my attention is worth something.
Yeah.
And when I know that it's worth something and I have the ability to control it, now I can decide who gets it,
Right.
more strategically,
Right.
based on who's willing to reward me for it.
Right.
And that
Well,
is
and
one of these elements of attention wealth that I think is really interesting.
yeah, for sure. And the other aspect that I think is super interesting is that um, when you think of it as wealth, you start understanding how to be judicious about how you spend it, which is the other thing that I think is a really powerful insight too. Where like if you think of all the times when you're absently surfing the internet or playing some mindless game on your mobile phone, you know that same wealth that could be spent learning a new skill or staying current on some employment trend that might change the prospects for your future career. I mean, obviously, we don't need to be maniacal about our judicious use of our attention. There's times when it makes sense to kick back and relax, but it is interesting to think that all of us have the commodity that is in question, which is our attention. And if we can get, I liked when you were talking about getting control of it. Um, and in a lot of ways, that is, I would view that as a learning trend too, like getting more intentional and efficient about how you use your learning time. Um, to me is almost like a subcategory of attention wealth, which to me ties back to the uh, smart self improvement trend, lifelong learning trend
Yeah.
that I think you've been talking about for quite some time.
Yeah, I think that when you think about, specifically with this idea of attention, I mean, I'll give you a practical example of how I think about it, right? So when I treat attention as something that is a form of wealth, now I start to decide, well, who deserves my attention, and
Mm-hmm.
who deserves my promotion, right? So for example, sometimes I'll see, I just did this the other day, I saw a headline that I thought was just so evil because it was designed to manipulate people.
Mm.
And so I took a screen grab of it and I shared it with my sort of friends and audience on social media without a link. Because I
Mm.
said, look, this made me angry and I wanted to share it, but I don't want to give them a link that
Mm-hmm.
now gives them more audience, because that
Yep.
means it's working.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
making those sorts of choices to say, look, I can just take a screen grab of it, I can share it. I share exactly what I want to share. I share my opinion, which is
Mm.
important to me to share,
Mm-hmm.
but I
Mm.
don't give them credit, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not linking back to it. I'm not driving eyeballs to them.
Yeah.
And those are the sorts of trade-offs that you're now seeing people make to say, look, the attention's valuable and I'm going to choose where I spend that attention and where I
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. It reminds me of we talked recently about digital literacies and some of the work of Doug Belshaw, who's a super interesting guy out of the UK, but he's characterized digital literacies as 8 things. There's like almost like Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, but the idea that there's an entirely new set of mindsets and skill sets that are hugely relevant to engaging in the attention economy that we're all living in. But at least as of now, there's very little formal education about any of this, which again to me brings us back to that informal education, instant knowledge through things like YouTube and podcasts and other formats where I think increasingly as stuff um, pivots to empower the the person who owns the attention, I think increasingly educating them and elevating their awareness, treating them as a smart, time-starved doer, I think is something that it's on all of us to do to a certain extent. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we do have to elevate this sense of personal responsibility, right? I mean, I actually talk a lot about the idea of non-obvious thinking as a core element of this book. And I know a lot of people will see the book in Non-Obvious Megatrends and think, oh, this is a book about trends, and let me just find out
Mm,
what the trends are. But
hmm.
that's actually part two of this book, right? And part
Yep.
one of this book is all about what it takes to be a non-obvious thinker.
Mm,
And I think that we are, and I just kind of posted about how I happen to believe that 2020 is going to be the year of bullshit.
mm. Yeah.
And that seems like a negative thing to say, and maybe it is on
Yeah.
some level. But to me, what that means is we're going to be surrounded by manipulation. Especially, I mean,
Yeah.
look, we've got an election this year, and
Yeah.
politicians are the biggest manipulators, right? I mean,
Sure.
David
Yep.
Ogilvy, the legend of advertising, once said that political advertising really ought to be not allowed
Yeah.
because it's the most dishonest form of advertising because it's all
Right.
lies.
Right.
And that's true. And they do things with that you can't do. Like I can't take out an ad saying that my competitor sucks and believes that children should not be allowed to grow up, right?
Right.
But you can take out political ads that say that stuff.
Right. Right.
And it's this weird double standard that's just like everybody's doing a money grab, and that's just wrong. But
Yeah.
what it means, I think, is when we're in this year of bullshit, we have to be strategically skeptical.
Mm, mm.
And that, to me, is an element of being a non-obvious thinker, not being jaded, right? Not
Right.
being just like so skeptical of everything that you can't really even trust anyone. That's not
Yeah.
a good way to live. Like nobody
Hmm.
wants to live like that.
Hmm.
But I think we can be strategically skeptical and look at something and say, hey, wait a second. Like, is this actually right? I mean, one of the examples I used, which was this great article that I came across this week, was all about the most popular list on Netflix.
Mm.
And if you look at like what's most popular, the most popular shows of the year on Netflix, one of the things that you notice is they seem to have a strangely high percentage of Netflix original shows.
Mm.
As opposed to other stuff that's on Netflix. And many of the most popular shows of the year, quote unquote, are things that came out a couple weeks ago.
Right.
So like, how could it be the most popular show of the year if it's only been
Right.
out for a couple weeks, like as opposed to
Sure.
things people have been watching all year, right? So like
Right.
these
Right.
sorts of things should make our bullshit sensors go off,
Right.
so that we kind of start thinking, hey, wait a second, is this true?
Right. Yeah. Well, and that speaks to the underlying crisis of trust that's out there too, where like people don't know where to turn for the truth these days, which is where I think some of your trends, even the one revivalism, seemed on point about that, where folks are almost gravitating back to simpler truths and more personal understandings of the world around them. In part because I think when you do more of the mass media, social media side of things, it just seems like there's so much noise there that you almost want an antidote to it. And I do think there is an opportunity for smart brands to help provide the curation function that the non-obvious editorial staff is trying to do. So even when you were talking about a curated perspective on the accelerating present, it does seem like an age of curation is certainly upon us, and which is why guidebooks like the non-obvious ones, um, I would imagine will do well. I hope to do well in the coming years. Any thoughts on that? And I'd love also to maybe begin to pivot to a broader time horizon, where I know you typically stick to your guns and your predictions tend to be really just for the 1 year ahead. But if you've been looking back at 10 years and the 2020s are upon us, I'd love to get a little bit more of your perspective on the broader megatrends. Maybe it is the megatrends themselves are likely to be relevant for for a good chunk of the 2020s. But I'd love to get your perspective on that. Both the notion of curation and how central that is to being an effective human and effective enterprise in the 21st century, in the 2020s, and then in particular, anything you think will be specifically relevant to a longer time horizon as we look ahead to like even 2030. Like what, let your wheels turn a little bit if you'd like, and I'd love to get some of your perspective on that.
I do think that curation is a huge opportunity for not just organizations, but also individuals, because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times what we have heard and look in the marketing world, one of the big trends of the last decade has been this shift towards content marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea behind content marketing is pretty simple. It says, look, marketing works best when you actually have something of value to say instead of just pushing ads out there and trying
Right.
to demand attention, which makes sense. But in a world where more and more people are creating quote unquote content, uh, the challenge becomes which of that content is crap and which of it's good. And so
Yeah.
we need more people and more organizations to become curators.
Mm-hmm.
And I do talk a lot about this word of curation and the role of a curator, because most people, if they're familiar with it at all, know it from the world of museums.
Mm-hmm.
And the principle's sort of the same, right? I mean, a curator at a museum takes 200 pieces of art and says, we're going to show you these 20 and put the rest into storage, because
Mm-hmm.
these 20 tell a story that is part of the exhibit. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what a curator does, right? The curator says, this is what you pay attention to, and we're going to remove the rest of it so that we can tell you something meaningful. They don't take
Mm-hmm.
all 200 pieces and stick them up and say, here you go, here's everything. It's not a
Right.
buffet, right?
Right. Right.
And that, I think, is a technique that we all can start to use with our ideas, and specifically that organizations can use to say, look, we are delivering expertise, particularly in a B2B sense, right? Particularly
Mm-hmm.
in a service oriented sense where what you're selling is expertise, not necessarily a product.
Right.
Because if you're
Right.
selling expertise and you're able to take that role of a curator, which is something I try and do in my weekly email that I send out every week,
Yep.
right? I say,
Yep.
I read hundreds of stories and I find the 5 that are most interesting and underappreciated, things that you probably
Mm-hmm.
haven't heard. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll share those stories because that's the service that I want to start to deliver to the audience that pays attention to me, to say, look, I'm spending all this time reading all these stories because you have a busy life and it's not part of your business to sit there and do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I can be helpful by doing that for you, then now I can deliver value, right?
Delivering value to time-starved doers everywhere, which is great. And then, what about the longer horizon? Any thoughts? As I was mentioning before we started recording, now that it's 2020, it does feel like we're living in the future. And I want my Matrix downloads, as I mentioned before. I want my levitation boots. I want it all, and it does feel at times like maybe we're not as far along as we could be. But then if you start thinking about the next 10 years, it feels like science fiction, it's going to be happening everywhere. And I'd love to get your perspective as a curator, as a storyteller, as someone who understands some of the narrative elements of looking ahead to what's on the horizon. Any perspectives as the new decade is kicking off?
Yeah, I actually spend a lot of time thinking about this because you're right. My usual time horizon is a year. And that's why every past edition of Non-Obvious has had the year on the front cover. It's
Mm-hmm.
Non-Obvious 2019, right? Like
Right.
that was the book. And this year, the title is Non-Obvious Megatrends, which, by the way, is much better from a book sales point of view because now I don't have
Right.
a limited shelf life, right?
Yeah. Right.
So that's one reason. But the other reason is that the horizon really does expand beyond this one year. And so every one of these megatrends, to me, I was writing thinking, what would someone think if they read this 20 years from now?
Mm-hmm.
Which was a different way of thinking than I've typically used in
Mm-hmm.
past editions of the book. And so throughout this process, I really spent a lot more time, I think, qualifying what I was going to write based on whether it would actually last over
Mm-hmm.
time or
Mm.
not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I really do feel like, and based on some of the early feedback I'm getting, people who are reading the book early feel this way too, that the ideas there do expand across a longer time horizon, which I think is really valuable for people.
Yeah, yeah. I was, in addition to 2020 being a year of bullshit, I think it's also likely a year of prediction and trend spotting. So I think, like I mentioned, I think we're in a good business to be in for the next year or so, because I think everyone is trying to get a read on where things are heading, and I think there's plenty of different directions. It reminds me of Andy Duke's book, Thinking in Bets. It helps to be probabilistic and to think about the different outcomes that might happen. But some of those involve us developing new skills and becoming better curators and becoming more intentional users of our attention wealth. And I think to stay on top of your game, I would certainly encourage you to, as a listener, I would encourage you to track down Rohit. And Rohit, where are the best places to find you, find your books, dig in further to many of the things we were discussing as part of today's show?
Well, if everything works out, then lots of places. I've got my site, which is just rohitbhargava.com. You can go to nonobvious.com/megatrends
Okay.
to find out about this book. You can go to nonobvious.com just to find out about everything else we're doing. You should be able to go into local bookstores, into bookstores in the airport to pick up the book as well. I mean, it should be in a lot of different places.
Yeah, and it does seem like a great airport read. It's the type of thing where, you can get value, like a micro learning is another trend. Like you can get value just digesting one or few of these trends and spending a little time thinking about them rather than trying to power through the whole book. So that's a nice element. Plus, the visualization and sort of the coherence that goes into the editorial voice is also quite impressive. So, any parting thoughts, Rohit? It's always wonderful to have you on Trending in Education.
Yeah, thank you. I love I love the conversations that we have, and we've done them in many different places. Like with Soundproof Studios and
Yeah.
like over the years. So it's always a great conversation. And look, I think that the topic that you talk about and what people are thinking about when it comes to the future of learning is so important to where we need our culture to go, right? I mean, we want people to be invested in better ways of learning and better ways of teaching and being educators and educators who deliver impact for students, and not just young students, but all ages of students.
Yeah.
And so I'm a deep believer in the mission of that, and I try and write about that. I try and be I teach classes too. I try and be an educator, an approachable educator, I guess.
Yeah.
And so I just want to say thank you for putting that out there, and thank you to the people who are listening, because chances are many of them are educators too. And we're in a place in our culture and in our world where I think that we need to support educators more and feed them. And so I just wanted to say thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've always thought some equivalent to thank you for your service for people who teach for a living or
Totally.
educate for a living.
I married a teacher, so I know they're underappreciated for sure.
Yeah, and it's also a labor of love too. So Rohit Bhargava, founder of the Non-Obvious Company, prolific author of Non-Obvious Guides, including the Non-Obvious Megatrends, which is dropping soon in January. Be looking for it. Find it wherever you find books. And thanks again for listening to Trending in Education. We'll be back again soon.